Hello and welcome to Dreamtime History. Imagine yourself standing on the most isolated inhabited island on Earth, 3,000 miles from the nearest continent, surrounded by nothing but endless Pacific Ocean. The wind whispers across volcanic slopes as you gaze upon one of humanity's most perplexing mysteries. Before you rise 887 stone giants, some weighing as much as 82 tons, carved from compressed volcanic ash over 7 centuries ago. These are the Moai of Easter Island, silent sentinels that have watched over this remote speck of land since the 13th century. Here, in this place where no trees grow tall enough to move such monuments, where no wheels existed, where the nearest civilization was thousands of miles away, Polynesian craftsmen created what seems impossible. They quarried, carved, and somehow transported these colossal figures across rugged terrain using only stone tools and human ingenuity. But how did they accomplish such a feat? Why did they invest generations of labour into these towering ancestors? And what really happened to the civilization that created them? Tonight, we journey to the edge of the world to uncover the true story of Easter Island's stone giants. But before we set sail, please take a moment to like the video and subscribe. It's a simple and wonderful way to support the channel, and it means a great deal to me. I'm also always curious to know where in the world and at what time you're joining me tonight. So, I'd really love to hear from you in the comments. You step carefully from the small fishing boat onto the dark volcanic shore, your feet finding purchase on stones worn smooth by countless centuries of Pacific swells. The engine's puttering fades behind you as you walk inland, leaving only the whisper of wind across basalt and the distant murmur of waves against an impossibly remote coastline. This is Easter Island, Rapa Nui, a single speck of land floating in the vast blue emptiness of the southeastern Pacific Ocean. The nearest inhabited land lies more than 1,000 miles away. The nearest continent, South America, stretches across an ocean gap of over 2,000 miles. You're standing at one of the most isolated places on Earth where human beings have ever chosen to build a civilization. As twilight settles over the volcanic slopes, you make your way toward Rano Raraku, the ancient quarry that holds the island's greatest mystery. The path winds upward through sparse grass and scattered stones, past the remnants of old field walls and the foundations of houses whose inhabitants vanished centuries ago. The wind carries with it the faint scent of dust and dried vegetation, the salt tang of the ever-present ocean, and something else, something harder to define. Perhaps it is simply the weight of time itself, pressed into this landscape like sediment in stone. Then you see them, rising from the earth like thoughts made manifest, like dreams carved from volcanic ash, stand the Moai. Not one or two, but hundreds upon hundreds of stone figures, their backs turned toward the sea, their impassive faces gazing inland across the rolling hills of their island home. Some stand complete, their massive torsos and heads silhouetted against the darkening sky. Others lie on their sides, half-finished, abandoned mid-creation, as if their makers had simply set down their tools one day and walked away forever. Still others are buried to their necks in centuries of accumulated soil, their full bodies hidden beneath the earth, giving them the appearance of disembodied heads contemplating eternity. You approach the nearest figure and place your hand against its surface. The stone is cool to the touch, carved from compressed volcanic ash called tuff, softer than granite but still enduring enough to have weathered 700 years of Pacific storms. The craftsmanship is extraordinary. Every line of the face has been carefully planned and executed. The heavy brows, the long straight nose, the thin lips set in an expression of solemn dignity. The ears are elongated, stretching nearly to the jawline. The eyes, though lacking pupils, seem to follow you as you circle the statue, as if some spark of awareness still flickers within the carved stone. This particular Moai stands about 13 feet tall, roughly average for the hundreds that populate this quarry. But you know that scattered across the island are giants that dwarf even this impressive figure. The largest completed statue, known as Pero, rises 33 feet into the sky and weighs approximately 82 tons. 82 tons of solid stone carved with primitive tools, transported across rough terrain and erected with nothing more than human ingenuity and an inexhaustible supply of determination. How does a civilization accomplish such a feat? How do you move a mountain when you possess no wheels, no metal tools, no large domesticated animals, no machinery of any kind? As darkness deepens around you, the questions multiply like stars appearing in the clear Pacific sky. 887 of these monumental statues have been catalogued across Easter Island, carved primarily between the years 1250 and 1500 of the Common Era. For 2.5 centuries, generation after generation of Rapa Nui craftsmen devoted their lives to this singular obsession, creating stone ancestors, permanent guardians, monuments to memory itself. The sheer scale of the undertaking defies comprehension. If you were to calculate the hours of human labour invested in this project, the number would stretch into the millions. Every statue represents years of work, dozens of skilled carvers, hundreds of support workers hauling tools and food and water to the quarry sites. Yet here you stand in perfect silence. No machinery hums in the background. No construction crews call to one another across the worksite. The ancient enterprise has been finished for centuries, its purposes fulfilled or abandoned, its meanings lost to time. The Moai keep their secrets, gazing out across the grasslands with the patient dignity of those who have seen civilizations rise and fall, who have witnessed the full arc of human ambition played out on this remote stage. The wind shifts, carrying new scents from the interior of the island, earth and stone, and the faint mineral tang of volcanic soil. In this moment, surrounded by nearly 900 stone witnesses to humanity's capacity for both creation and mystery, you begin to understand that Easter Island's story is not simply about statues. It is about what drives human beings to invest everything they have in projects that stretch far beyond their own lifespans. It is about the delicate balance between ambition and resources, between vision and reality. It is about what happens when a civilization pushes itself to the very limits of possibility. To understand how nearly 900 stone giants came to populate this remote island, you must first travel backward through time, beyond the silent quarries and toppled statues, to an era when Easter Island was not yet Easter Island at all. It was Tepito Tehenua, the navel of the world, a pristine volcanic landscape rising from the Pacific depths, clothed in forests and untouched by human hands. The year was approximately 1200 of the Common Era, perhaps slightly earlier, when the first Polynesian voyagers guided their double-hulled canoes through the swells toward this lonely speck of land. Imagine the courage required for such a journey. These navigators possessed no compass, no charts, no instruments save their intimate knowledge of stars and currents, wind patterns and wave formations. They read the ocean like a vast book written in salt water and light, interpreting the subtle signs that revealed the presence of land beyond the horizon, the flight patterns of seabirds, the colour changes in distant clouds, the almost imperceptible alteration in the rhythm of the swells. For weeks they had sailed eastward from the Marquesas Islands or perhaps the Gambier Islands, following ancient routes passed down through generations of master navigators, carrying with them everything necessary to establish a new life in an unknown world. When they finally beached their canoes on the rocky shores of what would become known as Rapa Nui, they found themselves in possession of one of the most isolated habitable places on Earth. The nearest populated islands lay over 1,000 miles to the west. The South American coast stretched across more than 2,000 miles of open ocean to the east. They had reached the farthest edge of Polynesian expansion, the final frontier of human migration across the Pacific. There would be no rescue missions, no trade expeditions, no casual contact with the outside world. Whatever civilization they built here would rise or fall entirely on its own merits. The landscape that greeted these first settlers was both promising and challenging. Easter Island is essentially a triangle of volcanic rock, roughly 14 miles at its widest point, formed by 3 extinct volcanoes whose peaks still dominate the island's skyline. The largest of these, Ranararaku, would later become the primary quarry for the Moai, but in those early centuries it was simply one of many crater lakes that collected rainwater in natural basins. The volcanic soil was fertile, capable of supporting the crops the Polynesian settlers had brought with them: sweet potatoes, taro, breadfruit and bananas. Native palm trees grew in abundance, providing timber for construction and fuel for fires. Yet even in those first generations, the limitations of island life must have been apparent. This was no lush tropical paradise like Tahiti or Hawaii. The climate was cooler, more variable. The growing seasons were shorter. The total land area was finite, bounded by ocean on all sides. Every tree cut down, every field planted, Every decision about resource allocation would have consequences that could not be undone by moving to new territory. The settlers found themselves in a closed system, dependent entirely on what the island could provide and what human ingenuity could create from those raw materials. As decades passed and the initial settlement expanded into villages, then into distinct communities scattered across the island's three corners, a unique culture began to emerge. The traditional Polynesian emphasis on ancestor veneration took on new dimensions in this isolated environment. Without regular contact with other island cultures, without the constant exchange of ideas and innovations that characterized more connected regions of Polynesia, the Rapa Nui people developed their own solutions to the universal human desire to honor their dead and maintain connections with their spiritual heritage. The geological foundation for what would become their greatest cultural achievement lay waiting in the crater of Rano Raraku. This extinct volcano contained vast deposits of compressed volcanic ash, a material known as tuff. Unlike the hard basalt that formed much of the island's surface, tuff was relatively soft and workable, dense enough to hold fine details but yielding enough to be carved with stone tools. The ancient Rapa Nui craftsmen discovered that basalt implements, carefully shaped into chisels called toki, could slice through tuff with remarkable precision. The volcanic crater thus became a natural workshop, providing both the raw material and the workspace for monumental sculpture. The earliest moai were probably modest affairs, simple representations of important ancestors carved to watch over family burial grounds or sacred sites. But as the techniques were refined and passed from master to apprentice, as the social organisation of the island grew more complex and competitive, the statues began to grow larger and more elaborate. What had started as a practical solution to the problem of ancestor commemoration gradually evolved into something unprecedented in human history, a civilization-wide commitment to monumental art that would consume the energies of countless generations. You can picture those early workshops, scattered around the base of Rano Raraku crater, where master carvers taught their apprentices the patient art of stone sculpture. The sound of basalt on tuff would have echoed across the crater walls as teams of workers slowly revealed the forms hidden within the volcanic ash. Dust would have hung in the air, settling into the clothes and hair of the carvers, marking them as practitioners of this specialized craft. At the end of each day, as the sun set over the Pacific, they would have stood back to assess their progress, watching the shadows play across the emerging faces of their stone ancestors. Now you must travel deeper into the heart of Easter Island's golden age, to those extraordinary centuries between 1250 and 1500, when the sound of stone striking stone echoed daily across Rano Raraku crater. This was the era when moai carving transformed from occasional craft to island-wide obsession, when entire generations devoted their lives to creating what the Rapa Nui people called Aringa Ora, the living faces of their deified ancestors. You crouch beside a half-finished statue in the ancient quarry, running your fingers along the tool marks that still score its surface after 7 centuries. The carvers worked methodically, beginning at the top of each figure and slowly revealing the hidden form within the compressed volcanic ash. First came the broad outline of the head, blocked out with heavy blows from basalt hammers. Then the patient work of refinement began, the careful shaping of the distinctive heavy brow, the long straight nose, the thin lips set in that expression of eternal contemplation that characterizes every moai. The tools themselves were marvels of Stone Age engineering. The primary implements were basalt hand axes called toki, carefully napped to create sharp cutting edges that could slice through the relatively soft tuff with surprising efficiency. These were supplemented by smaller chisels for detail work, obsidian scrapers for smoothing surfaces, and coral abraders for the final polishing. Each tool represented hours of skilled preparation, the basalt quarried from distant sites around the island, shaped and resharpened constantly as the work progressed. You can almost hear the rhythm of the ancient workshops, the steady percussion of stone against stone, the scraping of obsidian over volcanic ash, the occasional pause as carvers stepped back to assess their progress or consulted with the master sculptor overseeing the work. Teams of craftsmen laboured together on each statue, some roughing out the basic form while others concentrated on the intricate details of facial features. The division of labour was precise, with each worker contributing specialised skills to the collective enterprise. The moai that emerged from this process were far more than mere sculptures. They were Aringa Ora, living faces imbued with the spiritual essence of important ancestors. Each statue represented a specific individual, a chief, a master navigator, a renowned craftsman, or a revered elder whose memory deserved permanent commemoration. The faces gazed not outward toward the sea from which their descendants had come, but inward across the island landscape, watching over the villages and farmlands where their living relatives continued the work of daily survival. The average moai stood approximately 13 feet tall and weighed between 12 and 14 tons, but these figures represent only the middle range of an extraordinary spectrum. The smallest complete statues measure barely 4 feet in height, intimate portraits suitable for family shrines or personal devotion. At the opposite extreme stand the true giants of Easter Island sculpture, monuments that pushed the boundaries of what Stone Age technology could achieve. The largest completed moai, known today as Pero, rises 33 feet above the ground and weighs an estimated 82 tons. To put this in perspective, imagine trying to carve, move, and erect a sculpture weighing as much as 50 automobiles using only hand tools and human muscle power. The creation of such giants required not merely individual skill, but extraordinary social coordination. Teams of carvers worked for months or even years on a single statue, supported by networks of farmers who provided food, toolmakers who maintained the basalt implements, and labourers who cleared debris and prepared the statues for transport. The entire community invested in these projects, understanding that each completed moai strengthened their connection to the ancestral realm and enhanced their collective spiritual protection. As you walk among the abandoned figures scattered around Rano Raraku, you begin to appreciate the sheer scale of this undertaking. Nearly 400 statues remain here in the quarry itself, in various stages of completion. Some are little more than rough outlines carved into the crater wall. Others stand complete except for the final transport to their intended destinations. Still others appear to be finished monuments, their surfaces polished smooth, their features refined to perfection, yet they remain where their creators left them, as if the entire enterprise had simply ceased overnight. The mystery deepens when you realize that these quarry statues represent only a portion of Easter Island's total moai population. Hundreds more were successfully transported from Rano Raraku to ceremonial platforms around the island's coastline. The logistics of such transportation, moving multi-ton sculptures across rough volcanic terrain using pre-industrial technology, represents one of the most impressive feats of engineering in the ancient world. But beyond the technical achievements, what strikes you most profoundly is the sustained commitment these projects required. This was not the work of a single generation or even a single century. For 250 years, Rapa Nui society maintained its dedication to monumental ancestor veneration. Children grew up watching their parents and grandparents labour in the quarries. Young adults learned their trades in the shadow of half-completed giants. Elders passed away knowing that the work would continue long after their own deaths, that future generations would complete the statues they had begun and begin new ones in their turn. Standing in this ancient workplace, surrounded by the evidence of such extraordinary perseverance, you begin to understand that Easter Island's moai represent more than remarkable sculpture. They embody a civilization's deepest values: reverence for ancestors, commitment to continuity, belief in the importance of leaving permanent marks upon the world. In the patient accumulation of tool marks and the slow emergence of faces from formless stone, you witness humanity's eternal struggle to create meaning and permanence in the face of mortality and time. But the moai themselves were only one element of a far more complex social architecture that the Rapa Nui people constructed around their island home. To truly understand how these stone giants fit into the fabric of daily life, you must journey from the quarry to the coast, following the ancient pathways that connected the workshops of Rano Raraku to the ceremonial platforms where completed statues took their final positions as eternal guardians. These platforms, called Ahu, represent perhaps the most sophisticated engineering achievements in all of Polynesia. Imagine standing before Ahu Tongariki, the largest ceremonial complex on Easter Island, where 15 moai stand shoulder to shoulder on a stone platform that stretches nearly 600 feet along the southeastern coast. The Ahu itself is a marvel of precision construction. Massive basalt blocks fitted together without mortar, their surfaces dressed so carefully that a knife blade cannot slip between the joints. The platform rises in tiers, creating a monumental stage that elevates the Moai high above the surrounding landscape, allowing their watchful presence to be felt across miles of rolling grassland. The construction of such platforms required engineering skills that rival those demonstrated in the carving of the statues themselves. Teams of builders quarried basalt blocks from distant sites around the island, some weighing several tons each. These had to be shaped, transported, and fitted into place with extraordinary precision. The largest stones form the seaward face of each ahu, creating a massive retaining wall that has withstood centuries of Pacific storms. Behind this facade, smaller stones and coral rubble fill the interior spaces, while carefully graded surfaces on top provide level foundations for the Moai. You can walk the length of these platforms and marvel at the sophisticated understanding of structural engineering they represent. The builders understood load distribution, drainage, and the expansion and contraction of stone under changing temperatures. They created structures designed to last for centuries, monuments worthy of housing the most sacred representations of their ancestors. The time and labour invested in ahu construction rivaled that devoted to carving the Moai themselves, representing a parallel stream of specialised knowledge passed down through generations of master builders. The relationship between clans and their Moai reveals the intricate social dynamics that drove Easter Island's monumental enterprise. Each extended family group, or mata, commissioned statues to represent their most revered ancestors and to demonstrate their status within the island's complex hierarchy. The size and placement of these monuments became expressions of political power and spiritual authority. Larger statues required greater resources, more skilled craftsmen, more elaborate ceremonies. They announced to rivals and allies alike that this clan possessed the wealth, the connections, and the divine favour necessary to undertake such ambitious projects. Competition between clans likely intensified the Moai phenomenon, creating a dynamic where each group felt compelled to commission ever more impressive monuments to maintain their position in island society. You can imagine the discussions held in clan meeting houses as elders debated the merits of commissioning a new statue, calculating the resources required, negotiating with master carvers, planning the elaborate ceremonies that would accompany the statue's completion and installation. These decisions shaped the allocation of labour and materials across entire generations. The physical evidence of this social organisation can be traced in the ancient roadways that radiate outward from Rano Raraku like spokes of a great wheel. These paths, worn smooth by countless feet, and the passage of massive stone statues, connect the central quarry to ceremonial sites scattered around the island's perimeter. Following one of these roads today, you can still see the abandoned Moai that mark their routes, statues that never reach their intended destinations, frozen in mid-journey like travellers caught by some ancient catastrophe. Recent archaeological surveys have mapped an extensive network of these transport routes, revealing the sophisticated logistics required to move completed statues from workshop to final installation. The roads were carefully engineered, following gradual slopes where possible, avoiding the steepest ravines and rockiest terrain. Stone markers along their length suggest rest stops where transport teams pause to reorganise their efforts, or wait for favourable conditions to continue their journey. The organisation required for these transport operations must have been extraordinary. Moving a 12-ton statue across several miles of rough volcanic terrain would have required coordination between dozens of workers, from the rope specialists who rigged the hauling systems to the support crews who cleared obstacles and prepared temporary ramps over difficult passages. Food and water had to be provided for the work gangs. Tools needed constant maintenance and replacement. Progress was measured in yards per day rather than miles per hour. This infrastructure of roads and platforms, combined with the workshops and quarries, created what was essentially an island-wide industrial complex devoted to ancestor veneration. The scale of resource allocation was remarkable. At any given time during the height of the Moai era, significant portions of Easter Island's population were engaged in monument-related activities rather than direct subsistence work. This suggests a society with sufficient agricultural surplus to support extensive specialisation, sophisticated enough to maintain complex long-term projects across multiple generations. The social investment in this monumental enterprise went far beyond the physical labour of carving and construction. It required the development and maintenance of specialised knowledge systems, the training of craftsmen in techniques passed down through master-apprentice relationships, the coordination of work schedules across dispersed sites, and the ceremonial frameworks that gave meaning to the entire undertaking. Step away from the monumental platforms and engineering marvels for a moment, and imagine instead the quieter rhythms of daily life in this world of stone guardians. Picture yourself as a child growing up on Easter Island during the height of the Moai era, when these towering figures were as familiar as trees in a forest, as constant as the wind that swept across the grasslands from the limitless Pacific beyond. Your earliest memories would be shaped by the presence of these silent watchers. You would have learned to walk in their shadows, played games among their massive feet, dozed in the afternoon sun with your back against their cool stone surfaces. The Moai were not distant monuments to be admired from afar. They were integral parts of the landscape, as much a feature of home as the volcanic hills and the sound of waves against distant shores. You would have known which statue protected your family's lands, which ancestor's face gazed down upon your sleeping house each night, which figure your grandparents approached with offerings during times of uncertainty or celebration. The agricultural work that sustained this monument-building civilization unfolded in the shadow of completed Moai and within sight of Rano Raraku's busy workshops. Easter Island's farmers faced unique challenges that shaped every aspect of their daily routines. The island's soil was shallow and scattered unevenly across the volcanic landscape, requiring constant attention and careful management. Unlike the lush tropical islands elsewhere in Polynesia, Easter Island demanded intensive cultivation techniques to coax sufficient crops from its limited arable land. You would rise before dawn with your family to tend the scattered garden plots that provided your sustenance. Sweet potatoes formed the foundation of island agriculture, their hardy tubers capable of thriving in the relatively poor volcanic soil. These were supplemented by taro, bananas, and the paper mulberry trees whose bark provided fibre for clothing and rope. The work was methodical and endless, clearing stones from planting areas, building low walls to protect crops from the constant wind, carefully managing water resources during the island's occasional dry periods. The integration of a monument construction into this agricultural rhythm created a unique social calendar. During planting and harvest seasons, most available labour focused on food production, but in the quieter periods between these intensive agricultural phases, men would leave their families to join the work crews at Rano Raraku or the coastal construction sites. You might watch your father and older brothers disappear for weeks at a time, carrying their basalt tools and rolled sleeping mats, walking the well-worn paths toward the distant sound of chisels ringing against stone. The carving crews themselves developed their own rhythms and traditions. Imagine joining one of these teams as a young apprentice, learning the patient arts that had been passed down through generations of master sculptors. Your day would begin with the careful selection and preparation of tools, sharpening the basalt tuki that served as primary chisels, checking obsidian scrapers for chips or cracks, gathering the coral abraders used for final polishing work. The sound of preparation would echo across the crater as dozens of teams readied themselves for another day's labour. The work itself demanded both physical strength and artistic sensitivity. You would learn to read the grain of the tuff, to understand how the compressed volcanic ash would respond to different types of pressure and cutting angles. Master carvers would guide your hands as you learned to shape the distinctive features that marked every moai, the heavy brows that shadowed deep eye sockets, the long straight noses that divided each face with geometric precision, the thin lips that seemed always on the verge of speech. Progress was measured in fractions of inches, success calculated across months and years rather than days. As afternoon shadows lengthened across the quarry, the work crews would pause for their main meal, sharing food brought from families scattered across the island. These communal gatherings created bonds that transcended clan boundaries, forging friendships between men who might otherwise have been rivals or strangers. Stories were exchanged, techniques debated, progress on various statues discussed and evaluated. An elderly master might point out subtle improvements in a young carver's technique, or suggest modifications that would enhance a particular statue's spiritual power. The completion of a major moai became an occasion for island-wide celebration. When word spread that a figure was ready for transport and installation, families would gather from across Easter Island to witness the elaborate ceremonies that marked these momentous occasions. You would join the crowds that assembled to watch teams of specialists rig the completed statue for its journey from quarry to coastal platform. The air would be filled with chanting, the rhythmic clapping of hands, the deep voices of chanters reciting genealogies, that connected the stone ancestor to his living descendants. Some Moai received additional honours in the form of pukao, cylindrical red stone crowns quarried from Puna Pau, a separate volcanic cone on the opposite side of the island. These distinctive headdresses, some weighing several tons themselves, were carved from red scoria and transported to selected statues, where they were somehow lifted into position atop the already towering figures. The greatest mystery surrounding Easter Island's Moai lies not in their creation, but in their movement. Standing before these massive figures today, scattered along ancient roadways or positioned on their ceremonial platforms, you confront one of archaeology's most intriguing puzzles. How did Stone Age craftsmen transport sculptures weighing 12 to 80 tons across miles of rough volcanic terrain, using nothing more than human muscle, plant fibre rope, and ingenious engineering? For generations, scholars proposed various solutions to this transportation enigma. The most commonly accepted theory involved teams of workers dragging completed statues horizontally across the landscape, using wooden rollers or sleds to ease their passage over the rough ground. This explanation seemed logical given the materials available to the Rapa Nui people: palm trees for timber, dense basalt for tools, and abundant human labour organised through the clan system. Archaeological evidence appeared to support this interpretation. Wear patterns on some Moai suggested they had been dragged face down, and the discovery of what might have been transport roads reinforced the idea of horizontal movement. Yet nagging questions remained. The energy requirements for dragging multi-ton statues across Easter Island's undulating terrain would have been enormous, requiring hundreds of workers for each transport operation. The island's limited forest resources would have been rapidly depleted if large quantities of timber were needed for rollers and sleds. Most puzzling of all, many of the abandoned Moai found along transport routes stood upright, as if they had been walking toward their destinations when some catastrophe brought their journey to an abrupt halt. Recent research has revolutionized our understanding of Moai transportation through a combination of careful archaeological observation and practical experimentation. The key insight came from examining the design features of the statues themselves, details that earlier scholars had dismissed as purely aesthetic choices, but which may actually represent sophisticated engineering solutions to the problem of movement. Notice the distinctive shape of the Moai when viewed from the side. Unlike most sculptural traditions, which create figures with vertical orientation and stable bases, the Easter Island statues lean slightly forward, their centre of gravity positioned in such a way that they would naturally rock back and forth if given the proper impulse. Their bases are not flat platforms, but rather D-shaped curves that could serve as rockers. Their proportions, broad shoulders tapering to narrow hips, create a top-heavy distribution that would facilitate controlled rocking motion. These observations led researchers to propose a radical new theory. The Moai were transported upright, walking across the landscape through a coordinated rocking motion controlled by teams of rope handlers. This explanation suddenly made sense of features that had previously seemed merely artistic. The forward lean became a functional necessity for stable rocking. The curved base transformed from decorative choice to mechanical innovation. Even the broken Moai found along transport routes told a new story. These were not statues that had fallen from sleds, but figures that had toppled during failed walking attempts. To test this revolutionary theory, researchers created a precise replica of a Moai, carved from the same tough material and matching the proportions of the original statues. This experimental figure stood 14 feet tall and weighed 4¼ tons, roughly equivalent to an average-sized Easter Island statue. Using only rope and human power, teams attempted to walk the replica across level ground using techniques that would have been available to ancient Rapa Nui transport crews. The results were remarkable. With proper coordination, a small team of fewer than 20 people could indeed walk the replica statue across the landscape. 3 rope handlers positioned at the statue's head controlled its forward motion and direction, while additional team members stationed at the sides prevented it from rocking too far in either direction and toppling over. The statue moved with a distinctive swaying gait, tilting alternately left and right while progressing steadily forward at a pace of roughly 100 yards every 40 minutes. The implications of these experiments extend far beyond mere technical curiosity. If Moai were indeed transported upright through coordinated walking, the resource requirements for moving them across Easter Island would have been dramatically reduced. No timber would have been needed for rollers or sleds. Smaller transport teams could have handled larger statues. The mysterious roads radiating from Rano Raraku might not have been constructed highways at all, but simply paths worn by the passage of walking statues, their surfaces compacted by the repeated impact of rocking stone figures. Evidence supporting the walking theory can be found in details that archaeologists had previously overlooked or misinterpreted. Fracture patterns on broken moai along transport routes are consistent with forward-toppling failures rather than sideways falls from sleds. The positioning of abandoned statues suggests they were upright when their transport was interrupted. Chemical analysis of rope fragments found in archaeological contexts indicates the use of fibrous materials from paper mulberry and other plants that would have provided the strength and flexibility needed for the complex rigging required by walking transport. Perhaps most intriguingly, oral traditions preserved by modern Rapa Nui descendants contain references to statues that walked across the island under their own power, guided by spiritual forces and human cooperation. These stories, long dismissed by Western scholars as mythological embellishments, may actually preserve accurate memories of the transportation techniques used by their ancestors. The walking theory bridges the gap between scientific analysis and indigenous knowledge, suggesting that both sources of understanding have been pointing toward the same remarkable truth. At the height of Easter Island's monumental age, sometime in the late 14th or early 15th century, you could have stood on any prominent hill across the island and witnessed one of humanity's most extraordinary achievements spread out before you like a vast outdoor temple. Nearly 300 completed moai gazed inward from their coastal platforms, their massive forms silhouetted against the endless Pacific horizon. These were not the fallen, weathered figures you see today, but proud sentinels standing at full height, their red scoria crowns catching the first light of dawn, their carved faces maintaining eternal vigil over the communities they protected. The visual impact of this monumental landscape must have been overwhelming. Imagine the sensation of walking across the island during those peak decades, when every significant headland and bay was marked by the presence of towering stone ancestors. The largest platforms held multiple figures, 15 moai standing shoulder to shoulder at Ahu Tongariki, 7 at Ahu Akivi, dozens more scattered around the coastline in carefully planned arrangements that created sacred geography across the entire island. From many vantage points, you could see several groups of statues simultaneously, their forms creating a horizon punctuated by human achievement on a scale unmatched anywhere else in the Pacific. The society that created and maintained this monumental world had achieved a remarkable equilibrium between spiritual ambition and practical necessity. The agricultural systems that fed the population had been refined through generations of experimentation, creating sustainable yields from the island's challenging environment. Terraced gardens maximized the use of limited soil resources. Stone mulching techniques conserved moisture during dry periods. Careful crop rotation maintained soil fertility across growing cycles. The balance between population and resources appeared stable, with sufficient surplus to support both monument construction and the specialized craftsmen who devoted their lives to carving and transport. Religious and social institutions had evolved to support the Moai enterprise while maintaining order across a complex society of competing clans. The spiritual framework that gave meaning to ancestor veneration provided common ground for cooperation even among rival groups. Shared beliefs about the protective power of the Moai created incentives for maintaining and respecting monuments, regardless of which clan had commissioned them. The elaborate ceremonies associated with statue completion and installation reinforced social bonds and provided regular occasions for island-wide celebration. The technical mastery achieved by Easter Island craftsmen during this golden age represented centuries of accumulated innovation and refinement. Master carvers had perfected techniques for reading the grain of volcanic tuff, for creating the subtle variations in facial features that distinguished one ancestor from another, for achieving the precise proportions that enabled successful transport through the walking method. The engineering knowledge required for platform construction had been codified and transmitted through apprenticeship systems that ensured continuity across generations. Transport specialists had developed sophisticated understanding of rope dynamics, weight distribution, and the coordination required to move multi-ton figures across difficult terrain. Yet perhaps the most remarkable aspect of Easter Island's peak achievement was not the technical mastery or even the monumental scale, but rather the sustained social commitment that made such an enterprise possible. For nearly 250 years, generation after generation of Rapa Nui families had chosen to invest their surplus labour and resources in permanent monuments to their ancestors. Children grew up expecting to participate in this great work. Young adults planned their lives around the rhythms of carving seasons and transport operations. Elders passed away knowing that their descendants would continue the sacred enterprise, completing statues they had begun, and commissioning new ones to carry the tradition forward. The economic systems that supported this commitment functioned smoothly during the peak period. Surplus agricultural production provided food for specialised work crews. The clan networks that organised labour and resources operated efficiently, allocating tasks and sharing costs according to well-established protocols. Trade relationships within the island ensured steady supplies of specialised materials, basalt for tools from the northern quarries, red scoria for crown stones from Puna Pau, obsidian for cutting implements from various volcanic sources. The social mechanisms that resolved disputes and coordinated activities across multiple communities had proven their effectiveness through decades of successful cooperation. Standing in this landscape of completed monuments, surrounded by the evidence of sustained human achievement, the future must have seemed secure and predictable. The Moai would continue to protect their descendants. New statues would be added to commemorate important ancestors and demonstrate clan prosperity. The traditional ways of life that had enabled such extraordinary accomplishment would be preserved and transmitted to future generations. The island's resources, carefully managed through proven techniques, would continue to support both daily subsistence and monumental enterprise. In those peak decades, Easter Island had become something unique in human history, a small, isolated society that had chosen to devote a significant portion of its collective energy to creating permanent expressions of spiritual belief and cultural identity. The Moai stood as testament to what could be achieved when human communities aligned their efforts around shared purposes that transcended individual lifespans. They represented the triumph of long-term vision over short-term convenience, of collective commitment over individual comfort. Yet even during those golden centuries, subtle changes were beginning to alter the delicate balance that had sustained Easter Island's monumental enterprise. The signs were not immediately apparent to those living through them, changes that unfolded across decades rather than years, shifts in the island's ecological systems that would only become obvious in retrospect. Like shadows lengthening imperceptibly across a sunlit landscape, these emerging complications crept into the margins of daily life, affecting decisions and possibilities in ways that contemporaries could not have fully understood. The most significant of these changes was occurring in Easter Island's forest ecosystems. Pollen samples extracted from lake sediments and bog cores reveal a gradual but persistent decline in native tree species, particularly the giant palms that had once dominated the island's landscape. These towering trees, some reaching heights of over 80 feet with trunks 6 feet in diameter, had provided essential resources for the Rapa Nui people since their first arrival. Palm nuts supplemented the island's limited food resources. Trunk fibres were woven into rope and cordage. The massive logs could be fashioned into canoes for offshore fishing, or rolled beneath heavy loads as transport aids. The disappearance of these forests was not sudden, but rather a slow process of attrition that accelerated over generations. Each palm tree cut for construction or transport needs was one fewer to produce seeds for future growth. The island's limited land area meant that cleared forest could not regenerate quickly enough to replace what was being harvested. Competition from introduced plants brought by the original Polynesian settlers may have further stressed native species. Climate variations, subtle but persistent, could have affected rainfall patterns and growing conditions across the island. Archaeological evidence suggests that this deforestation process reached critical levels sometime during the 15th century, precisely when Moai construction was approaching its most intensive phase. Charcoal fragments from cooking fires and workshop sites show increasing reliance on smaller, scrubby vegetation rather than substantial timber. The remains of tools and implements reveal adaptations necessitated by changing resource availability. Smaller rope fibres replacing the substantial cordage that had previously been available from palm trees, alternative materials substituted for traditional construction techniques. The social implications of these environmental changes rippled through Easter Island's clan-based society in complex ways. As prime resources became scarcer, competition between different groups intensified. The Moai themselves became focal points for this escalating rivalry, with clans commissioning ever larger and more elaborate statues to demonstrate their continued prosperity and spiritual authority. Size became a measure of status in ways that may not have been as pronounced during earlier periods, when resources were more abundant. Evidence of this intensifying competition can be seen in the archaeological record of statue production during the later phases of Easter Island's monumental period. While earlier Moai had averaged around 13 feet in height and 12 to 14 tons in weight, the figures carved during the final centuries of active construction show a marked increase in scale and ambition. Some of the largest statues ever attempted were begun during this period, massive figures that would have required unprecedented investments of labour and resources to complete and transport. Yet many of these ambitious projects were never finished. Walking through Rano Raraku today, you encounter dozens of partially completed Moai, some barely roughed out from the surrounding tuff, others nearly finished but abandoned before their final details could be carved. The most telling evidence comes from the transport routes themselves, where increasing numbers of completed statues lie scattered along the ancient roadways, as if their journeys toward coastal platforms had been interrupted and never resumed. The growing frequency of these abandoned transport operations suggests that the logistical challenges of moving large Moai were becoming increasingly difficult to resolve. Perhaps the labour forces required for successful walking transport were becoming harder to assemble as communities faced competing demands for their limited human resources. The rope systems essential for controlling statue movement may have become more difficult to construct as suitable fibre sources dwindled. The coordination between multiple clans that had previously enabled large-scale transport operations may have broken down as competition intensified. Subtle changes in settlement patterns across the island also reflect emerging resource pressures. Archaeological surveys reveal a gradual shift toward more dispersed habitation sites, possibly indicating that traditional village locations were becoming less viable as local environments changed. Defensive structures begin to appear in the archaeological record during this period, stone towers and fortified compounds that had not been necessary during the earlier, more cooperative phases of Moai construction. The transformation of Easter Island from monument-building civilization to a society in upheaval was neither sudden nor simple. Rather than the dramatic collapse often portrayed in popular accounts, what emerged during the 17th and 18th centuries was a complex unravelling of the social and environmental systems that had sustained Moai construction for nearly 2.5 centuries. The evidence for this transformation lies scattered across the island in ways that require careful interpretation, separating romantic legends from archaeological reality. The most visible sign of this transformation is found in the current state of the Moai themselves. Today, most of the statues that once stood proudly on their ceremonial platforms lie toppled, face down in the grass, or buried beneath centuries of accumulated soil. Yet contrary to popular imagination, these fallen giants were not victims of some sudden catastrophe or environmental disaster. Archaeological investigation of toppled Moai reveals that most were deliberately pulled down during periods of interclan warfare that began sometime in the late 17th or early 18th century and intensified through the 1700s. The evidence for intentional toppling is unmistakable once you learn to read the signs. Fallen Moai show fracture patterns consistent with being pulled forward from their platforms rather than simply weathering away or succumbing to earthquakes. Many lie in orderly rows, all facing the same direction, suggesting coordinated efforts to bring them down rather than random acts of destruction. Stone tools found near toppled figures appear to have been used to break the statues' necks at strategic weak points, ensuring they would fall completely rather than remaining partially upright. This systematic destruction of monuments represents a fundamental shift in Easter Island's social dynamics. The Moai, which had served for centuries as symbols of clan prestige and ancestral protection, became targets in conflicts between competing groups. Rather than inspiring reverence, the statues of rival clans came to represent threats to be eliminated. The spiritual framework that had given meaning to monument construction was gradually replaced by more immediate concerns about survival and dominance in an increasingly constrained environment. The timing of this social transformation coincides with the first recorded European contact with Easter Island. On Easter Sunday of 1722, Dutch explorer Jacob Roggeveen arrived with 3 ships, becoming the first known European to set foot on the island. His brief visit, lasting only a single day, provides a snapshot of Rapa Nui society during this critical transition period. Roggeveen described a population he estimated at 2,000 to 3,000 people, living in what appeared to be a landscape already showing signs of environmental stress and social tension. Subsequent European visitors throughout the 18th century documented a society in continuing upheaval. Spanish expeditions in 1770 and British visits by Captain James Cook in 1774 described an island where traditional authority structures seemed to be breaking down. The elaborate ceremonies and social coordination that had enabled monument construction were being replaced by more fragmented competitive arrangements. Population estimates varied widely, but most observers noted signs of decline from whatever peak the island had previously supported. Yet the cessation of Moai carving had begun well before European arrival, as evidenced by the hundreds of unfinished statues that remain in Rano Raraku quarry. These abandoned figures tell a story of gradual rather than sudden termination of the monument enterprise. Some appear to have been left incomplete decades or even centuries before European contact, suggesting that the social and economic systems supporting large-scale sculpture were already under stress by the late 1500s or early 1600s. The reasons for this abandonment are complex and interconnected, defying simple explanations about resource depletion or environmental collapse. Climate reconstructions suggest that the island experienced periods of increased drought during the 16th and 17th centuries, potentially stressing agricultural systems that were already operating near their limits. The deforestation that had been progressing gradually for centuries may have reached critical thresholds where essential materials for construction and transport became prohibitively difficult to obtain. Social factors likely played equally important roles in the decline of monument construction. As environmental pressures increased, the labour and resources required for large-scale Moai projects may have become unsustainable luxuries that communities could no longer afford. Competition between clans for shrinking resources could have made the cooperation necessary for major construction projects increasingly difficult to achieve. The spiritual beliefs that had motivated monument building may have evolved in response to changing circumstances, with new religious practices replacing ancestor veneration as the primary focus of collective effort. The introduction of new diseases by European visitors accelerated social disruption throughout the 18th and 19th centuries. Smallpox, tuberculosis, and other infectious diseases devastated populations that had no prior exposure or immunity. The social knowledge required for monument construction, the specialized skills of master carvers, the coordination techniques for transport operations, the ceremonial frameworks that gave meaning to the enterprise, was lost as communities struggled simply to survive demographic collapse. By the early 1800s, when more detailed European accounts became available, Easter Island had transformed into something unrecognizable from its monumental past. The elaborate clan structures that had organized society around ancestor veneration had given way to more immediate survival strategies. The Moai, once symbols of spiritual protection and social prestige, had become reminders of past achievements that could no longer be sustained or even understood by their descendants. In the centuries that followed the end of Moai construction, the people of Easter Island demonstrated remarkable resilience in adapting to their transformed circumstances. Rather than simply succumbing to the challenges that had brought their monumental enterprise to an end, Rapa Nui society reorganized itself around new priorities and different expressions of cultural identity. The silence that had settled over the quarries of Rano Raraku was not the silence of total abandonment, but rather the quiet that follows one chapter of human endeavour before another begins. As the elaborate clan rivalries centred on monument construction gave way to more immediate concerns about survival and adaptation, new forms of social organisation emerged to replace the systems that had sustained Moai carving for centuries. The most significant of these was the development of the Birdman cult, a religious practice that redirected competitive energies away from stone carving toward annual competitions centred on the offshore islets of Motu Nui. Each spring, representatives of different clans would swim to these rocky outcroppings to collect the first egg laid by migratory sooty terns, with the successful competitor becoming the year's Tangata Manu or Birdman, earning special privileges and authority for his sponsor. This transformation represented far more than a simple substitution of one ritual for another. The Birdman competitions required different skills and resources than monument construction had demanded. Success depended on individual athletic ability and courage rather than the massive coordination of labour that had characterised Moai projects. The prizes were temporal rather than permanent, yearly honours rather than monuments designed to last for centuries. The geographic focus shifted from the inland quarries to the dramatic sea cliffs and offshore waters that emphasised Easter Island's maritime character rather than its role as a stone-carving workshop. Yet the Moai themselves did not simply disappear from Rapa Nui consciousness. Even as their creation ceased, and many were toppled during periods of conflict, the great figures that remained standing, particularly those at Rano Raraku that had never been transported to coastal platforms, continued to serve as focal points for cultural memory and identity. Children growing up in the post-monumental period would have encountered these silent giants as permanent features of their landscape, mysterious remnants of ancestral achievement that demanded explanation and interpretation. Oral traditions preserved knowledge about the statue's creation and meaning, even as the technical skills required for their production were gradually lost. Stories about the Moai walking across the island, guided by spiritual forces and human cooperation, maintained connections between the living population and their monument-building ancestors. These narratives served not merely as historical records, but as sources of cultural continuity, linking contemporary communities to the extraordinary achievements of earlier generations. The practical adaptations required by changing environmental and social conditions led to innovations in resource management and survival strategies. Without the large-scale coordination systems that had supported monument construction, island communities developed more localized and flexible approaches to agriculture and material production. Garden techniques were modified to work with smaller labor forces and reduced cooperation between clans. Alternative materials and methods were developed to replace resources that were no longer readily available. Archaeological evidence reveals increasing sophistication in these adaptation strategies during the post-monumental period. Tool technologies evolved to make use of materials that had been less important during the era of intensive stone carving. Food storage and processing techniques were refined to maximize the nutritional value of limited resources. Settlement patterns shifted toward more defensible locations, reflecting the increased importance of protecting community resources during periods of reduced cooperation between groups. The population that remained on Easter Island after the demographic disruptions of the 18th and 19th centuries maintained essential elements of Polynesian culture while adapting to their unique circumstances. Traditional knowledge about navigation, agriculture, and social organization was preserved even as it was modified to fit new realities. The Rapa Nui language continued to evolve, incorporating new concepts and experiences while maintaining connections to its Polynesian roots. Perhaps most remarkably, the cultural identity that had originally motivated Moai construction proved flexible enough to survive the end of monument building itself. The concepts of ancestor, veneration, clan loyalty, and connection to place that had inspired centuries of stone carving found new expressions in changed circumstances. The Moai became symbols not only of past achievement, but of cultural persistence, representing a people's ability to create meaning and continuity despite dramatic transformations in their material circumstances. The islanders who lived through these transitions demonstrated something profound about human adaptability and resilience. Rather than being defined entirely by the loss of their monumental traditions, they created new forms of cultural expression that honoured their heritage while responding to contemporary needs. The skills that had enabled their ancestors to carve stone giants, patience, cooperation, long-term thinking, reverence for tradition, were redirected toward the equally challenging task of cultural survival in a transformed world. Today, Easter Island exists in a world vastly different from the one that witnessed the creation of its stone giants. Modern visitors arrive not in double-hulled Polynesian canoes after weeks of ocean navigation, but in commercial aircraft that traverse the same Pacific distances in a matter of hours. Yet stepping onto this remote landscape, you still encounter the same fundamental questions that have puzzled travellers for centuries. How did human beings accomplish such extraordinary feats in so unlikely a place? And what do their achievements reveal about the possibilities and limitations of human ambition? The Moai that greet contemporary visitors represent both archaeological recovery and ongoing mystery. Many of the figures that early European explorers found toppled and abandoned have been painstakingly restored through decades of international conservation efforts. Ahu Tongariki, with its 15 massive statues standing once again in disciplined formation along the southeastern coast, required years of careful reconstruction using modern engineering techniques combined with traditional knowledge preserved by Rapa Nui descendants. The sight of these restored monuments against the Pacific horizon creates an experience that connects present-day observers directly to the spiritual and aesthetic intentions of their ancient creators. Yet for every statue that has been re-erected, dozens more remain as the centuries of neglect left them, scattered across the landscape, half buried in accumulating soil, or lying broken where they fell during the conflicts of previous centuries. These unreconstructed figures serve as equally powerful reminders of impermanence, demonstrating how even the most ambitious human enterprises eventually succumb to time and changing circumstances. Walking among both restored and fallen Moai creates a complex emotional landscape where triumph and loss, achievement and abandonment coexist in the same visual field. Modern scientific investigation continues to reveal new dimensions of the Moai phenomenon that were invisible to earlier observers. The walking theory of statue transport, confirmed through careful experimentation and computer modelling, has revolutionized our understanding of ancient engineering capabilities. Ground-penetrating radar surveys have revealed that many of the heads visible at Ranararaku actually possess full bodies buried beneath centuries of accumulated sediment, suggesting that the scale and sophistication of Moai construction was even greater than previously imagined. Chemical analysis of tool fragments and rope fibers provides increasingly detailed pictures of the technical knowledge that enabled monument construction. These ongoing discoveries underscore one of Easter Island's most important lessons. Human ingenuity can accomplish seemingly impossible things when properly organized and sustained over sufficient periods of time. The transportation techniques that moved 82-ton statues across difficult terrain, using only rope and human coordination, represent innovations as remarkable as any produced by more technologically advanced civilizations. The social systems that maintained complex, multi-generational construction projects demonstrate organizational capabilities that many contemporary societies would find challenging to replicate. Yet Easter Island's story also provides sobering insights into the relationship between human ambition and environmental sustainability. The deforestation that contributed to the decline of Moai construction offers a cautionary tale about resource management in closed systems. The intensifying competition between clans that led to ever larger statues and eventual social conflict illustrates how competitive pressures can drive communities toward unsustainable practices. The abandonment of partially completed projects scattered across Ranararaku suggests that even the most impressive human enterprises can reach limits beyond which they cannot continue. These lessons acquire particular relevance in our contemporary moment of global environmental challenges and resource constraints. Like Easter Island during its peak period, modern human civilization operates within a closed system, in our case, the entire planet rather than a single island. The same dynamics that drove Rapa Nui society toward unsustainable monument construction, competition for status, short-term thinking that prioritizes immediate advantages over long-term consequences, social systems that reward visible achievement over sustainable practices, continue to shape contemporary decisions about resource allocation and environmental management. The current status of Easter Island as a UNESCO World Heritage Site reflects global recognition of the Moai as cultural treasures that belong not only to their creators' descendants, but to all humanity. This designation brings both opportunities and challenges. Increased tourism provides economic benefits to the modern Rapa Nui community, while creating new pressures on fragile archaeological sites. Climate change and rising sea levels threaten coastal monuments that have survived centuries of Pacific storms. The balance between preservation and access, between cultural respect and economic development, reflects in microcosm the complex negotiations required for sustainable stewardship of irreplaceable human heritage. Perhaps most profoundly, Easter Island's Moai continue to serve their original function as bridges between past and present, connecting contemporary observers to the eternal human impulses that drive monument construction across cultures and centuries. Standing before these ancient figures, you participate in the same fundamental experience that motivated their creation, the desire to create something permanent and meaningful that will outlast individual human lives. The questions they pose about resource allocation, social priorities, and the relationship between ambition and sustainability remain as relevant today as they were during the height of Rapa Nui civilization. As twilight descends once more over the volcanic slopes of Easter Island, you find yourself returning to where this journey began, standing among the silent figures of Rano-Raraku as shadows lengthen across the ancient quarry. The light is fading now, painting the moai in shades of amber and rose, their carved features softened by the gentle transition from day to night. The wind carries with it the same scents you encountered at the beginning of this exploration: salt from the distant ocean, dust from weathered volcanic ash, the faint mineral tang of stone that has absorbed centuries of Pacific weather. Yet something has changed in your perception of this landscape during the hours spent travelling through Easter Island's deep history. The silent figures surrounding you are no longer merely mysterious monuments demanding explanation. They have become familiar companions, each one representing specific human choices, particular moments of creation, individual expressions of beliefs and values that once moved entire communities to extraordinary effort. You now understand that each statue embodies countless hours of patient labour, generations of accumulated skill, and social agreements complex enough to sustain ambitious projects across centuries of changing circumstances. The story you have followed from the first Polynesian settlement through the golden age of monument construction to the eventual transformation of Rapa Nui society reveals patterns that extend far beyond this remote Pacific island. In the rise and persistence of the Moai tradition, you witness humanity's eternal struggle to create meaning through permanence, to leave marks upon the world that will outlast the brief span of individual lives. The same impulses that drove ancient craftsmen to spend years carving stone ancestors continue to motivate contemporary efforts to build lasting institutions, preserve cultural heritage, and establish legacies worthy of remembrance. The challenges that eventually brought Easter Island's monumental enterprise to an end, resource constraints, environmental pressures, social competition, the difficulty of maintaining cooperation across generations, remained fundamentally familiar in our own historical moment. The Moai serve as both inspiration and cautionary tale, demonstrating both the remarkable achievements possible through sustained collective effort and the vulnerability of even the most impressive human enterprises to changing circumstances beyond their creators' control. Standing here in the gathering dusk, surrounded by evidence of both triumph and transformation, you are struck by the curious relationship between stone and memory, between material permanence and cultural continuity. The Moai were carved from volcanic ash, a material softer and more workable than granite, but still capable of enduring for centuries when protected from the most severe weathering. Yet their true persistence lies not in their physical durability, but in their capacity to evoke questions and inspire contemplation long after their original meaning has been partially obscured by time. What will archaeologists of future centuries make of our own monuments and achievements? Which of our carefully constructed institutions will survive the inevitable transformations that await every human society? What stories will be told about our priorities and values based on the physical evidence we leave behind? The Moai invite such reflection not to inspire anxiety about mortality and impermanence, but to encourage appreciation for the mysterious alchemy by which human effort transforms temporary materials into lasting symbols of meaning and aspiration. The darkness deepening around Rano-Raraku brings with it the profound quiet that characterizes remote places far from the busy centers of contemporary civilization. In this stillness, the presence of the Moai becomes almost tangible, as if the centuries of human devotion invested in their creation has imbued them with a kind of patient awareness. They have witnessed the full arc of their civilization's rise and transformation. They have stood silent through conflicts and reconciliations, through periods of abandonment and rediscovery, through the arrival of new peoples and ideas that have reshaped the island's cultural landscape. Tonight, as you prepare to rest and allow the day's explorations to settle into memory, the Moai continue their eternal vigil. They remind you that human beings possess remarkable capacities for both creation and adaptation, that the most impressive monuments often emerge from the most challenging circumstances, and that the deepest satisfactions of human existence may lie not in achieving permanent solutions, but in participating with dignity and creativity in the ongoing conversation between past and future, between individual aspiration and collective memory, in the gentle rhythm of wind across ancient stone, in the quiet persistence of carved figures that have outlasted the civilization that created them. You find an invitation to rest in the knowledge that human endeavour, however temporary its material manifestations, contributes to patterns of meaning that extend far beyond any single lifetime or culture. Sleep comes easily in such company, cradled by the patient presence of ancestors, whose greatest achievement was their recognition that some questions are more valuable than their answers, and that some monuments endure not through their permanence, but through their capacity to inspire continuing wonder.